We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Chesam and Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 108b. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that by shochet bachutz, if somebody slaughters kachim outside of the Beis Hamikdash, but he slaughters it lehedyot for the sake of a regular person, so then we say chayiv. That is not true by halah. It's not true by offering up kachim bachutz. There, if it's lehedyot, then we say pater. And then when it comes to two people doing the shochet bachutz, it's the opposite. If two people are shochet bachutz, we say pater. But if it's two people who offer up the karban bachutz, so then we say chayiv. And the Gemara wanted to understand what is the distinction. And the Gemara says the reason why we include shochet lehedyot bachutz is because it says in the pasuk ish ish, and therefore that is an inclusion. And the Gemara asks when it comes to offering up, there it also says ish ish, and the Gemara says, well, that inclusion, that is for the idea of two people offering it up, that we say they're chayiv. And the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why don't we say the same thing when it comes to shochet, that two people do the shchita should be chayiv? And the Gemara said, no, the pasuk says hahu, and that means echad v'lo shnayim, it has to specifically be one person. The Gemara says, well, it says the same word hahu by halah as well. Why don't we say over there it's echad v'lo shnayim? And the Gemara says, no, hahu, when it comes to halah, is lemuute shogeg anus umuta. That comes to exclude somebody who does it by mistake, who does it by accident, who does it in some fashion, again, that is not with intention, and that's what the yahu is for. But the Gemara says, if so, hachanami miboy lemuute anus shogeg umuta. When it comes to shochet as well, why don't we say the hahu is coming to exclude anus shogeg and muta? And the Gemara says to that, shrei hahu ksivi, by shochet, it actually says hahu twice, so we have one to exclude anus shogeg umuta, and then we have the other to say echad v'lo shnayim. The Gemara continues, Vela la Hashem lamali, but if that's the case, why does it even say la Hashem by shchita if we're saying that it can even be lehedyot, that the person is chayiv? And the Gemara says to that, that's lahotzi seir hamishtalech, that's to exclude the he-goat that is sent away on Yom Kippur. There we do not say this liability. Rashi explains, Lemu'ute shogeg anus umuta, we exclude these cases of mistake or accident. Dahachi darish b'toras kohanim, this is a drush in Toras Kohanim, kol hahu degabe v'nichras, anytime it says hahu by kores, k'sheyeshno b'havayoso uvedaito, that's when it's with the person's intention and knowledge, v'lo anus, v'lo shogeg me'elov, not when it's by accident, not by mistake, or muta, al yedei acherim, the difference between shogeg and muta is the mistake is caused by others, shogeg is the mistake is within himself. Trei hahu ksivi, it says hahu twice, dam yechashev lo ish hahu b'shchita ksiv, that's by shchita, elo Hashem d'chsiv gabe shchita lamali, what do we need the word la Hashem for? By shchita. And to that the Gemara says, Lahotzi seir hamishtalech, we exclude the he-goat that is sent away on Yom Kippur. To mashma haroi li karev lashem, the pasuk is understood to mean that which is fit to bring to offer lashem, chayav and ala bachutz. There's a liability if it's done outside the Beis Hamikdash. V'she'eno omed lashem, but if it is not set to be laHashem, ein chayav and ala bachutz, then there is no chayav if it's done outside the Beis Hamikdash. That's why seir hamishtalech is excluded. Well, the Kamon Meperak Basra Darish Lo Tana de Braisa Hachi. Later on in the last parak, we're going to darshan, the Tana of the Braisa is going to darshan it like this: V'goli b'shchita. Now this halacha is true by shchita. V'uadin lahalah, and this halacha would equally be true by offering up. To hamigmar gemira mehadadi, they're learned from each other. Keda amr, like we said earlier, la'arif parshios, that there's a mixture of parshios. All the halachas are essentially identical. Bar mehanach trei chumrei demasnis, and with the exception of the two stringencies in our Mishnah on the previous Amud, the mefarshi kroi bekulu bein lechiyuva bein lepetura, because the psukim explain explicitly by all of them whether we're saying in terms of liability or in terms of exemption. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Chomer b'halah, again there's a stringency by offering up. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbon, and the sages taught in a Braisa, Ish Ish, the Pasuk says, Ish Ish. Again, that's an inclusion. Matam Lomer. Why does it say ish ish? L'rabo shnayim sha'achzu be'aver, that includes two people that they take hold of a limb of a helu and they offer it up. They do it together. Shechayav, and the pasuk is saying by halah two people are chayiv. Sheyachol, because one might have thought v'halo dinu. It's logical. Umaha shochet lehedyot shechayiv. If by slaughtering, where if it's lehedyot we say chayiv, but shnayim sha'achzu b'sakin v'shachtu p'turim. But if two people grab the knife and do the shchita together, we say pater. Again, all talking about outside the Beis Hamikdash. So hamala lehedyot shepater, one who offers up to a regular person where we say exempt, eino din sheshnayim sha'achzu p'turin, doesn't make sense to say that if two people grab, we're going to say pater. Talmud lomar ish ish. That's the pasuk that says ish ish as an inclusion. Divrei Rabbi Shimon, these are the words of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yossi says hahu, when the pasuk says hahu, so echad v'lo shnayim, it really means one and not two. Imkein ma Talmud lomar ish ish. If so, why does the pasuk say ish ish? Dibra Torah kalashim b'nei adam, the Torah just speaks the way that man speaks. And the pasuk over here that's being quoted, Va'aleim Tomar, the full pasuk, Va'aleim Tomar ish mi beis Yisrael, umin hager asher yagor b'sochem asher yala ola ozavach. It's talking about ha'alah in this pasuk. That's why we say ish is l'rabos by ha'alah, that two people again are going to be liable. And then Rabbi Yossi, he says, no, the pasuk says hahu, and therefore from the pasuk, from the word in the pasuk which says hahu, there we actually learn an exclusion, and we say echad v'lo shnayim. And we will note that the word hahu that Rabbi Yossi is referring to, that comes in the very next pasuk, Parak Yud Zayin, pasuk Tes, there it says the word hahu, and again Rabbi Yossi understands echad v'lo shnayim. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon hai hahu, and Rabbi Shimon, what does he do with this word hahu? Mi boy le'lemute shogeg anus muta, that comes to exclude again by mistake or by accident. Rabbi Yossi mehu hahu. Rabbi Yossi learns that from the fact that it could have said hu and it says hahu, so it actually teaches us two things. Rabbi Shimon hu hahu lo darish, and Rabbi Shimon doesn't darshan hu hahu. Rabbi Yossi, now Rabbi Yossi midahai ish dibra Torah kolashim b'nei adam, from the fact that he understands that ish over here is not an inclusion, it's just dibra Torah kolashim b'nei adam. So hahu ish nami dibra Torah kolashim b'nei adam. Why don't we say the same thing by ish when it comes to shchita? We should say that it's dibra Torah kolashim b'nei adam. And if that's true, v'yala hashochet lehedyot minolei dechayev, where does Rabbi Yossi know that hashochet lehedyot, one who slaughters for a regular person, that he's chayev? And the Gemara says to that, Nafkale midam yechoshev lo ishahu dam shafach. He learns it from the pasuk which says dam yechoshev lo ishahu va'afilu hashochet lish. Even somebody who slaughters for the sake of a man, for the sake of a person, that person is going to be liable. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hela v'chazer v'hela v'chulu. If the person offers kachim bachutz, and then he has a second lapse of awareness and offers up again, and then another one and offers up again. So there's a machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says he's chayiv on each one, and Rabbi Yossi says he's just chayiv one. And the Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish says, machlokas bedalid v'hei evarim. The machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah is by 4 or 5 limbs. The mar savar that one holds, ki ksiv la'asos oso, when it says in the pasuk la'asos oso, and we understand that to mean al hasholim hu chayiv, that he's chayiv if he offers bachutz something that is whole, ve'eno chayiv ala chaser, and he's not chayiv for something which is missing, akol behema ksiv, that pasuk is going on the entire animal. Umar savar, and the other one holds akol aver ve'aver ksiv, that pasuk is going on each limb. Avol aver echad, but when it comes to just one limb, divrei hakol eno chayiv ala achas, there everybody would agree that the person is only chayiv one. And Rashi explains, Akol behema ksiv, again, it means to say that it's going on the entire behema. When it says al hasholem chayiv and al hachaser you're not chayiv, it's going on the entire behema. This is Reish Lakish's approach. Al kol ha-behema hu chayiv, he's chayiv on the entire animal, offering that up bachutz. Ve'eno chayiv al aver echad, he's not chayiv on just offering one limb. Hilkach kula chada halahi, and therefore, offering up limb by limb, it's all considered one halah, one offering. And so therefore, again, that's the machlokas tanoim. One says it's going akol behema, and therefore, since it's going akol behema, we're talking here where a person offered up 4 or 5 limbs, and that is the machlokas. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's going on akol behema, it's going on the entire animal, and therefore the entire animal, only once the entire animal is offered up is there going to be a liability. That's why there's one liability. And again, Rabbi Shimon says, no, that's not really true. We say that even if it's kol aver ve'aver, it's going on kol aver ve'aver, so each limb is considered independent. But again, avol be'aver echad, but according to Reish Lakish, let's say it would be one limb. Ve'hikrivu lechatzoin, and it would be brought in different pieces and halves. La'achar shekriv shar ha'ivorim, after all the rest of the limbs were brought. Te'ilu olav levado, because if it was just that one, afilu hikriv shalim, even if it was brought whole, pater le Rabbi Yossi, there Rabbi Yossi would say it would be exempt. In other words, according to Rabbi Yossi, let's say, for example, a person would only bring one limb, so there Rabbi Yossi would say completely exempt. We're talking here in a situation where after all the avarim were brought, then the last aver is being brought, and it's being brought into pieces. So there, again, we're going to say everybody agrees, Eino chayiv ala achas, you're only chayiv one. O mayri shepaka me'al ho'esh, or the case could be you're not bringing lechatzoim, but let's say some of it becomes dislodged from the fire, v'chazr v'hechziro, and then he goes ahead and he brings it again. So there, divrei hakol, there everybody agrees, halo achasi, that's one offering, to ha'oso ksiv, it says oso, sholem velo chaser, it has to be sholem, and not chaser, meaning to say again, when we're talking here about just one aver, if you bring that in different pieces, there certainly we're going to say sholem velo chaser, and therefore you're only going to be chayiv one, that everybody agrees to, but the question is, if you're bringing 4 or 5 avarim, there you have a machlokas. Again, Rabbi Shimon says you're chayiv on each aver, and Rabbi Yossi says you're chayiv just one. And we will note over here that Rashi simply means to say, according to Rabbi Yossi, if a person would only bring one aver, not the entire animal at all, so then he'd be totally exempt, because again, a kol behema, we're going on the entire animal. The entire animal has to be offered in order for there to be liability, according to Rabbi Yossi, and that's why, again, we're talking about the last aver in the Gemara, when it says be'aver echad, if it's brought in different pieces, it's brought lechatzoyin, so then again, according to Rabbi Yossi, that'll just complete the entire animal. There's going to be one liability, and even according to Rabbi Shimon, there's just going to be one liability on that particular aver, because according to Rabbi Shimon, it's going la'asos oso, is going on each aver. And the Gemara continues with a second approach to the machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says machlokas be'aver echad. The machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi is actually by aver echad, by one limb. The Marsavar that one holds mukterei panim shechasru v'hela bachutz. Let's say it was something that was fit to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash, and then it was chaser, it was missing, and it was offered bachutz, offered outside the Beis Hamikdash. Chayiv, one is chayiv. Umarsavar potter, and one says potter. Avol bedalid v'hei. But let's say it's 4 or 5 limbs, divrei hakol chayiv al kol aver ve'aver. There everybody agrees that there's an independent liability on every single limb. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yochanan Amar machlokas be'aver echad. Rabbi Yochanan says the machlokas is by one limb, meaning udekuli alma oso akol aver v'aver ksiv. According to the approach of Rabbi Yochanan, everybody agrees that the word oso is going on each limb. There's a liability for every aver. Uman de mechayiv, and the one who says chayiv, meaning to say the one who says that chayiv multiple, savar mukterei pnim, he holds that if something is fit to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash, shechasru, and then let's say it's missing v'helu bachutz and offered outside the Beis Hamikdash, chayiv. So then you're actually chayiv on that, even if you don't offer the entire thing. Doham mahadrinon pokin lemizbech, and the reason for that, the logic for that is that when something gets dislodged from the mizbech, you do return it to the fire. Dehavalu chaser, and that really is a case of chaser. That means that it's missing. It's not the whole thing. V'chiksiv oso, and when it says oso, and oso is saying that chaser is not something that there's a liability for. Am mukterei chutz ksiv, that's talking about something that was not fit to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash. Umar savar potter, and the other one holds potter. And Rashi says denafka le milo yevienu. Again, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. He's going to learn it out from the pasuk of lo yevienu in this situation. Rabbi Yishmael, like Rabbi Yishmael that we had earlier. And again, we're going to say that in this situation, even in a situation of mukterei panim shechasru v'helu bachutz, we're going to say potter. And so again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, everyone would agree that on a whole aver, there's an independent liability, chayiv al kol aver v'aver. But again, if you have part of one aver, let's say it's not an entire limb, so there you have a machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah, and we're talking specifically about a situation of mukterei panim, something that would have been fit to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash, and now was offered outside the Beis Hamikdash, and it was offered chaser. So that's the machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi. And the Gemara continues, upliga de ula. Now this argues on ula, diyamar ula, because ula says hakol modim. Everybody agrees, b'mukterei panim shechasru v'helu bachutz. If you have again something that was fit to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash that is now missing, it's not whole, and it was offered outside the Beis Hamikdash shechayev. Everybody actually agrees in that case that there's a liability. That's why this argues, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, this is a case where there's a machlokus. There's a machlokus by mukterei panim shechasru v'helu bachutz, whether it's chayev or not. That's why this argues with. That's why Rabbi Yochanan argues with ula, and ula says lo nechleku ela b'mukterei bachutz. The only machlokus is, let's say something was not fit to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash. It was only being offered outside the Beis Hamikdash. Shechasru v'helu bachutz, and again that was a case. Let's say the item is chaser and it's offered outside the Beis Hamikdash. There is a machlokus, the mar savar potter, that one holds that it's potter because it's chaser, umar savar chayev, and the other one holds chayev. And the Gemara continues with another version of ula. Ika diamri. There are those that say amar ula says hakol modim b'mukterei chutz, everybody agrees if it's something that's not fit to be offered inside the Beis HaMikdash, mukterei chutz, shechasru v'helu b'chutz, that again is missing, and it was offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, it's chaser, it's not whole, shehu patr, that in that case everyone agrees it's exempt, that's a case of chaser, and lo nechliku, where is their machlokes, ela b'mukterei pnim, they're arguing by something which is fit to be offered inside the Beis HaMikdash, shechasru, if that's chaser, v'helu b'chutz, and it's offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, there you have a possibility of being liable. The mar savar pater or mar savar chayiv, one holds pater and one holds chayiv, and the idea is again something that is mukterei panim. The reason why it's more likely to be chayiv if it's chaser is because again something that actually is offered inside the Beis HaMikdash, if it becomes dislodged, you do return it to the fire, and therefore that indicates that that is something that is worth offering. And the Gemara says, "Upligi da'avua de Shmuel alishna kama de Ula." The father of Shmuel argues on the first version of Ula, the Yamar avua de Shmuel, because the father of Shmuel says, "Keman mahadrinon poken legavi mizbeach." According to whom do we return something that gets dislodged from the mizbeach? Who are we following when we say to return that? Keman, who is that like? The lo Rabbi Yossi, that's not like Rabbi Yossi. Meaning avua de Shmuel is talking about mukterei panim, and he's saying there's a machlokes by mukterei panim. It's the lo Rabbi Yossi, and therefore since the avua de Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, is saying there's a machlokes there, that goes against the first version of Ula, because in the first version of Ula, everybody agrees by mukterei panim. Rashi says, "Poken shepoken me'alo eish," it gets dislodged from the fire. The lo Rabbi Yossi, it's not like Rabbi Yossi. The kevan de bifnim b'nei haktorah ninu, because since inside is something that could be burned, it's roy for the mizbeach. V'af agav de chosr, even though it's missing. So b'chutz nami mechayev. So then we're going to say if it's offered outside, there's going to be a liability. But mukterei pnim shechosru v'helu b'chutz, again in a case where it was fit to be inside and it was chosr and offered outside. Alma kosavar avud de Shmuel de Rabbi Yossi amukterei pnim shechosru v'helu b'chutz polik. You see that the father of Shmuel understands that Rabbi Yossi is arguing on this case of mukterei panim, which is again chaser, and it's offered up b'chutz. And we will go back and read one earlier Rashi as well. Lo nechliku ela b'mukterei chutz mar savar chayiv. Again, according to one version, the machlokas tanoim is by mukterei chutz, whether chaser is chayiv or not. According to that, the chiksiv oso, according to the version that even by mukterei chutz, we would say there's a possibility that chaser is chayiv, then the word oso is lemuute pachos mikazayis asa. That's not coming to exclude chaser, it's coming to exclude if it's less than a kazayis, shein haktorah shlema. That's not called a whole burning, a complete burning. Uchididarish leila kamon, as the Gemara will darshan later on. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Veino chayiv ad sheyala." He's only liable if he offers up a chutz on a mizbeach. And Rabbi Shimon says, even if it's just on a rock or a stone, the Gemara understands that the first opinion is actually the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, that it has to be on a mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, "My time with Rabbi Yossi." What's the reason of Rabbi Yossi that it has to be on a mizbeach? Tichsiv, because it's written in the pasuk, "Vayiven Noach mizbeach lashem." It says Noach built a mizbeach. Rashi explains, "Vayiven Noach mizbeach alma afilu bama yochid." You see, even a private bama, a private altar, shiba chutz, which is outside the mikdash, eina hala below mizbeach. It's not called an offering without a mizbeach. That's the source for Rabbi Yossi. Am Rabbi Yochanan, my time with Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yochanan says, what's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Techsiv, because it's written in the pasuk, "Vayikach manoach eskedi ha'izim ves hamincha vayal al hatzur lashem." It says that he offered it up on the rock, and so you see, as Rashi says, al hatzur below binyan mizbeach l'shem kach. There was no building of a mizbeach for that purpose. V'kari lehala, and that was called an offering. And the Gemara says, "V'idach nami." Now the other one also, "V'aksiv vayiven mizbeach laHashem." Doesn't it say vayiven mizbeach laHashem? What does Rabbi Shimon do with that? The Gemara says, "Hahu gova bialma." That was just for some height. Rashi explains, "Gova bialma kederech kol haaretz sheyei noach l'shtamish v'lo lechovas mizbeach." The reason why you build a mizbeach, it's a little higher up, and therefore it's easier to use. That might be what that pasuk meant to indicate. V'idach nami haksiv vayikach manoach. And the other opinion also, meaning Rabbi Yossi, what does he do with the pasuk of vayikach manoach, which indicates that even a rock is sufficient to offer something? And the Gemara says to that, "Horas shohai," so that was just a ruling for that particular time. It wasn't meant ledoros, it wasn't meant for all generations. And the Gemara continues, "V'bayisem." If you want, we could say Hainu Taima de Rabbi Shimon, that the reason of Rabbi Shimon actually is as follows. Kedetanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, "Mizbeach Pesach Ol Moed ve'ein Mizbeach bebam." It says Mizbeach is by the Ol Moed, but there's no halacha of Mizbeach when it comes to a private altar. Lefika chela ala selo ala even chayiv. Therefore, if somebody were to offer on a rock or on a stone, he would be liable. The Gemara questions just the phrasing of this, because the Gemara understands that we're talking about when the private bama was permitted. So it shouldn't say chayev yotza miboile. It should say that he has fulfilled his obligation in a time when a person is allowed to use a private mizbeach. So it doesn't have to be a mizbeach. It could be a rock. It could be a stone. And the Gemara explains hachi kamar. This is what it means to say. Lefikach, therefore, b'shas isur habamos, in a time when private mizbeach is aser, when a private altar is aser, then helo al haselo alo even chayev. If he offers up outside the mikdash on a rock or on a stone, he is going to be chayev. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rav Yossi Rav Chanina. Rav Yossi Rav Chanina asks the following question: in the time when a bama was permitted, keren v'kevesh v'yesod v'ribua, what about all these halachas by the mizbeach in general that needs to have a corner and a ramp and a yesod, a base, and ribua, it has to be square? And Rashi says all of these, keren v'kevesh v'yesod v'ribua, the kaimelon to ma'akvi b'mizbeach hamishkan. The halacha is that these are all requirements by the mizbeach of the mishkan, b'perakot she'kadoshim, in perakot she'kadoshim. So the question that Rav Yossi, Rav Chanina asks is, Ma'u sheyakvu bebama, are these requirements by a private mizbeach? Amar le Rav Yirmiyah said to him, Tanya, we learned in a brayso, keren v'kevesh v'ribua v'yesod, ma'akvin bebama gedola, by the great bama, these are all requirements. Ve'ein ma'akvin bebama ketana, but they are not ma'akev by the small bama. Rashi explains, Bebama Gedola Af Nov V'Givon, that means to say, in Nov and Givon Shayu Bamos Tzibor, those were bamos that were for the community, that's what it means, a big bama. V'chol shekein Shiloh Beis Olamim, certainly if you're talking about Shiloh, certainly if you're talking about the Beis HaMikdash, that would be considered Gedola, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Tes Amud Aleph.